recorded. Everyone is automatically muted, and we will unmute people for the Q&A. You can see fellow participants by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen, so you can kind of see who's here. And you can use the participant features at the bottom of that participant screen to raise your hand during the Q&A, or to ask questions, or you can ask questions using the chat. We will be monitoring the chat, and then everyone home will unmute participants with their hands up for the Q&A section. If you're calling in and not on the phone, you don't have a participants icon, you can raise your hand by dialing *9, and there will be these instructions will be on the screen when we get to the Q&A sections. And then the slides will be sent out after the meeting, so everybody can reference. So I think you can move it ahead, Dorcas, to the next slide. So this is our agenda for today. It's pretty packed, so I am going to do the very happy task of introducing Mayor Libby Schaaf, who is going to kick us off today. So if you can move ahead, Dorcas, one slide. And unmute Mayor Schaaf.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of this very unusual world we're living in right now. While the work has gotten more difficult, it certainly has also gotten more urgent. And so thank you for everyone kind of sticking to the task of finishing this systems modeling at a time when it couldn't be more important. We know that resources are becoming more scarce, the need is becoming greater, and that is why smart, well-documented, data-driven plans that are also rooted in our values are going to be more important than ever. And so truly, I am so grateful to everyone who has made this possible, because it really is more important than ever. I have a list, so to be sure I thank everybody correctly. Joyce and Stephanie from HUD, our two technical assistance experts, it has been a pleasure working with you. Thank you for doing this with us. Jessica from Everyone Home, you have been phenomenal in kind of herding the cats and keeping us all on task. And particularly your leadership, and I will end with a special shout out to the racial equity group. But let me also recognize the leadership committee co-chairs, Colleen Chalwa, who, I mean, what a job she has right now, and yet Colleen, to continue your commitment to this work is so incredible and just speaks volumes about what a dedicated professional you are. And we always look forward to continuing to deepen our partnership between the city and the county. Doug Biggs, who is an amazing volunteer chair for Everyone Home, your leadership has been great. And of course, your leadership for the Alameda Point Collaborative. You know, just let me end by also kind of recognizing that this is not just any systems modeling exercise. This is not just another plan. I really want to commend the contribution that Darlene Flynn and others in the racial equity working group have given to this work really for the whole country. And thank you for recognizing our partners at HUD that this analysis is so important and must become part of this exercise anywhere it goes. And it's this kind of structural change that is what we have to continually be looking for. We are in a crisis, we have to manage that crisis, but we have got to, as leaders, continue to lift our heads up from the day-to-day disaster in front of us and look big picture at the structures and institutions that are causing these problems to persist. Otherwise, we're just continuing to bail water out of a leaking boat. So with that uninspiring visual analogy, let me just say I'm excited to see this final product and to get to work to actually implement it. And that is just my passion, my commitment. Do not hesitate, anyone on this call, to pick up the phone, call me, text me, make sure that as the mayor of Oakland, I am doing everything within my power to implement this system and this plan that we are unveiling today. So with that, thank you, tremendous gratitude to everyone and our continued partnership.
Thank you, Mayor Schaaf. Dorcas, can you move the slide ahead? So now I have the great pleasure of introducing that participants in that racial equity impact analysis. You're going to be hearing from Susan Shelton. She's on the Everyone Home Leadership Board and Emeritus of the City of Oakland. Sarah Ting, Senior Policy Advisor to Supervisor Chan. And Darlene Flynn, Director of the Department of Race and Equity for the City of Oakland.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon. I get to kick us off on this overview of the equity work that has been done thus far. And starting with this slide that says Confronting Racial Equity in the Homeless Housing Crisis Response System. And I think that this is our work today. And I just want to mention that this is our work in every area of city government and of our society if we hope to eventually end crises like homelessness. We are going to have to be confronting racial equity from whatever location we can. Wherever we are is the right place to start. So it's very exciting to me to be invited to join this effort. It is a rich with opportunity to confront racial inequity and to create racial equity. We have a crisis on our hands. There is no doubt about it. When you look at this slide that shows the increase in homeless population in Alameda County over the last decade or so, you can see that in the last 4 years, we've had a profoundly disturbing jump in the number of homeless people in our communities, and this is a doubling in 4 short years. That is certainly not something that anyone wanted to see or that most of us would have anticipated. You could see for quite a number of years we had a problem. We had a crisis already. We had 10 years to end homelessness and we had very high numbers, and then all of a sudden we see this extraordinary jump that is now very much reflected in conditions in our streets and under our freeway overpasses and so on. So it's not our imagination when we think that things have gotten much worse. They have. And I think that for the communities that are particularly for the communities that are dramatically overrepresented in this population, it's worse than a crisis, it's a catastrophe. It has reached that level of impact in our communities, in some of our communities, where it is truly catastrophic. And we are in danger of having a real difficult time recovering from it. So here you can see the actual data that we've been working on. And when we do racial equity impact analysis, we are data driven. The first thing we do is actually look for disparities. I know that sounds maybe a little disconcerting to some people, but we actually look for the disparities because we know that in the disparities are the clues. In the disparities are the clues to addressing the problem in a real and meaningful and deep way. So we can see here that African Americans and Indigenous people are represented in homelessness now at 4 times their representation in the general population. And this is in stark contrast to most other groups. And the next closest group in overrepresentation is multiracial, which undoubtedly includes a lot of people who, like myself, also identify as African American. So there's some overlap there. And then you have some other groups that are doing better, and I always say that's good. It's not great. There's still homelessness in those groups as well, but we don't have as much of a lift in those groups as we do in Indigenous and African Americans. So we start with that because we always want to lift from the bottom. We want to make sure that we don't leave those who are most impacted behind, just because the ones who are most impacted are the hardest to reach in some cases. So we have to work overtime, and that's what equity work is. It's going that extra mile, giving that extra effort to looking at what's going on here and to unpacking the causes. Next slide, please. So what we have looked at mostly in our work is how structural, institutional, and systemic racism is impacting homelessness. This is the piece that is usually left out. We have a lot of other pieces built into our systems. We can see that we're taking addiction, substance challenges, and those sorts of things, disability and veteran status. There are many other things that we tend to keep track of a little bit better than we have the impacts of structural racism. So that extra effort is to center this additional cause of these outcomes and the reason that they are disparately impacting different racial groups. So this also helps to adjust the way we think about racism, because I think oftentimes we've been socialized to think of racism as individual mean or bad treatment of people of color. And of course that does happen, it does exist, it is real. But what we are looking at here really is how systems are designed to perpetuate disparities, and how systems have been part of the problem, which means when we're looking at something like systems modeling, it makes a lot of sense to examine those systems for what is missing or what is not working well or what needs to change in order to close these disparities. We've given you here the Aspen Institute definition for structural racism, and it's a good one. It's very specific, but the most important thing to remember is that it's about systems. It really is. And that every system is perfectly designed to create exactly the outcomes that it's creating. It may or may not have been intentional, but what is coming out the end of the pipeline is reflective of what has happened along the way. And so this work that we did really looked at those pieces, tried to pull those pieces out. Next slide, please. So one of the big efforts that we undertook was to actually check in with people who are experiencing homelessness now in the county. And we ran 8 focus groups. We didn't have very much time and we didn't have very much resource, but I think the group did an amazing job, and this was really not something that I led. This was led by others in the equity group to put these focus groups together quickly to make sure that they were well representing those impacted communities, to move them around the county so that we got some feedback from different parts of the county, different circumstances, different conditions. And we ended up with some really good information as a result of it. You can see here we've given you the actual demographic breakout of the people that we got to talk with, and also the groups that we partnered with to make this effort possible. We could not have done it without these partnerships with groups that are serving these communities. And we talked to about 2/3 of the people we talked to are currently experiencing homelessness, and about 1/3 are formerly homeless folks. So we were able to get different perspectives from that angle as well. What we saw was that it is very clear that Black and Indigenous people both are flowing into homelessness at a much higher rate and are returning to homelessness at a much higher rate. The data showed us that. We already knew that going into these discussion groups, but what we could use the focus groups for was to understand the why and what happened underneath that data. So quantitative data tells us how much, qualitative data that you collect by talking to people who are having a lived experience tells us how's it working, why is it turning out like this, and what happened. Next slide, please. So the long and the short of it is that we understand just from doing good equity work that when we get into these crisis or catastrophic outcomes, and they manifest in a lot of ways, they can come through in mass incarceration, in educational outcomes, health outcomes, poverty, etc., that all of those things collectively work together to create a lifetime of racial discrimination and racialized events, sometimes big events, sometimes small events, but they add up to something that ultimately works to intensify the barriers to housing stability. And this is true here and everywhere else, but we have seen that it is having an even more devastating impact in parts of the country where housing markets are extremely heated, where high desirability markets like the Bay Area and Seattle, Washington, my hometown, are areas where there's a lot of growth in jobs, not as much growth in housing, and a lot of pressure on cost. And a lot of people who live in those areas are not situated to be able to keep up with the cost of housing. And so this all makes sense that racism, discrimination in housing and in other areas would contribute and amplify those outcomes. So we are really trying to right a very large wrong, but the data shows that if we cannot stabilize people in housing, it is very hard to help them stabilize and overcome other disadvantages that they've experienced in their life. So housing and ending homelessness is fundamental to addressing many of the other areas, and it's very self-perpetuating. It's a cycle, it feeds itself. So I think that's my last slide. Those are just big picture framing slides about what we've been doing and what we've been paying attention to, and there's a lot more to come in this presentation. So thank you very much.
All right. Great. So, hi, this is Sarah Tang, Supervisor Chan's office. I'm going to take the next few slides to illustrate some of the qualitative findings, as Darlene spoke to, from the systems modeling focus group data collection that we did. So on this slide, I just want to, there are a few experiences that folks shared. I'm just going to read one aloud here. One participant who identified as an American Indian woman, aged 25 to 39, shared that high rents period, having to have 5 times the income. It's hard for those with bad credit or generations of bad credit. There's nothing to build upon. And so with this experience and many like it, we found that there are these common themes where the historic, intergenerational, and ongoing impacts of structural racism affected entire families and their communities, which was a weathering impact on the social networks that may have otherwise prevented homelessness. And next slide, please. We had I want to share another story from a participant who identified as African American, aged 18 to 24. And this, this individual said, I was trying to go to school, but also needed to find housing. So I went to transitional housing. I dropped out of school and I'm trying to work full-time and find housing. In this circumstance, we found many folks who are facing racial discrimination and economic inequality, and how these are inherently interrelated. And as these stories tell us, that structural factors such as generational poverty, educational barriers, and adverse health impacts, these also serve as barriers to work and income that enable sustainable housing, and especially in our impacted housing market. Next slide. Another participant identified as African American male, 50 to 64, and said, either you eat or you have gas or you have somewhere to live. I went through certain programs to get housing, pay first and last month's rent, but your credit score is bad and people who don't want to rent, if you have a subsidy. So as this story illustrates, and others, many like it, the experience of this sort of vicious cycle where there's really no way out, where short-term and small interventions really don't get to the heart of the issue, and structural racism continues to perpetuate some of the ongoing, the historic, the intergenerational and ongoing ways that racism plays out and the outcomes of these particular groups. And on that, I'm going to turn over to Susan Shelton, who will speak more to our findings.
Oh, Susan, let me make sure you're unmuted here. 1 second. I unmuted you before, but maybe it. There you go. There you go.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Susan Shelton, and I just want to give a bit of context in terms of having worked in this arena for 20 plus years. I was in most of the focus groups, and my eyes were opened wider than all the years that I actually did this work. And I really want to thank the City of Oakland for helping sponsor these focus groups and allowing us to provide stipends and food when people would come out and tell and share their stories with us so we could have a better understanding. It has been, again, useful and eye-opening. So one of the overriding comments that kept coming to us in every group that we did, you'll see through these comments, the challenges of applying for housing are intensified for homeless people of color. And these are examples of the barriers that present themselves when you don't have resources or even a source to squeeze those resources out of. They are built-in barriers to your economic conditions, which are predictable by race. So for people in unstable conditions already, imagine having to jump through these hoops. Even for someone well-situated, it's a process. The third comment, the applications you fill out for apartments are really intrusive. I don't understand some questions. They want to go so deep into your life. A lot of stuff you forget, and they want you to go back 10 years ago. I don't remember where I lived 10 years ago. If you leave out anything minor, they turn the application down. I fill them out to the best of my knowledge, but it's not enough. We heard comments similar to this over and over again. Next slide, please. Low-income communities of color are being displaced from Alameda County, and homelessness services participate in that displacement. The first quote, what we are finding is that we're going to have to leave the city and county to find an affordable place to stay. And then I'll have to find a new job and leave our home here. I'm still looking for housing, and 2 years into it, Antioch and other places are miles away. I built a life here for myself, and I want to stay here. I want to be close to my son and grandson. Nothing has come up in Oakland. One consistent communication from a variety of focus groups across the county was that place matters. Belonging is so unrecognized to human wellness and well-being. When you're displaced from your families, your networks, and work, it's a different set of circumstances you have to face, in addition to being homeless. I was living in Oakland with my mom, but the rent got too high, so we moved to Stockton for 2 years. A lot of people that are from the Bay Area that are all moving out there, but it's nicer out here. I was born and raised in Oakland. Latino man, age 50 to 64. Next slide, please. One, again, consistent comment. Low income does not mean high service needs. That we listen to folks tell us that they get viewed through the lens of the label of homelessness and what we know and what we have to earn scores on and how many people are chronically homeless and what kind of co-occurring disorders happen when you're chronically homeless. And they've been saying to us, look at me, listen to me, my situation. I am not a statistic in any other way other than I'm a number that is within the homeless population, but my circumstances, my path here, where I am currently and what I'm present to is unique to me. Can you hear me? If I don't need that amount of services and I just need additional money to help me become stabilized, can you hear that? And that's a comment to our system and how we operate that was very resonant with me. Next slide, please. We're very clear in going through this process, at least I am, and I think my partners in the Race and Equity Committee would also agree that this data, these focus groups, finding out what we found out is only the beginning of the work. That from here on out, we have some road markers that tell us how to get a better understanding of the service system we're providing and designing out in the world. That we want evaluating the system to be an annual event through that race and equity lens, that you can't really see how it is impacting from the regulations and guidelines that we provide and how it impacts those people who are the recipients of this. We are now very clear that disaggregating performance outcomes by race tells an entirely different story than what we think we know about the population. That looking at policies and practices is critical for us to shift that system, what we call modeling our homeless program. That direct services with clients, document readiness, hiring processes, organizational culture, things like the higher you go up the employment ladder in terms of our agencies and departments that provide these services, the more homogenous they become and not reflective of a wider voice, particularly that is predominant in people of color in the homeless arena. That needs to shift, that the way we think, listen to, and hear what the issue is has to change in order for us to get a clearer view of the impact of the programs that we're running. Thank you. Please.
Yeah. Did someone want to add something?
That was me, dear.
Okay. Thanks, thanks, Susan and Darlene and Sarah. So that was the racial equity impact analysis, the findings from that study. We're now going to move to talk about the final recommendations from the system modeling work. And I'm very happy to introduce Joyce Probst-McAlpine from Abt Associates.
Hey Joyce, give me just a second here. You're listed under something a little unusual. There we go. Your last name.
There you go. Well, hello everybody. I'm sorry we're meeting virtually instead of in person, but I'm really glad that we're at this point of having final recommendations. And I wanted to say before we get started that, of course, when we were doing the modeling, we didn't plan for a pandemic or an economic collapse. And so a lot of these assumptions were developed before the situation that we're in. But I think that you as a community, having gone through this process, especially having the model informed by the equity analysis, gives you a great starting point to plan your response. And as Mayor Schaaf said, this is only more urgent than when we started in October. So thank you, and next slide, please. So system modeling, the final result really is about inventory recommendations for optimal system. And it is a process of visualizing how you would like to serve people instead of thinking about just expanding how you're currently serving people. And the equity report that we just heard is a great reason why you don't want to just expand what you're currently doing. And I just wanted to pick up on a couple of themes that people had already raised, that and reducing disparities for the race and ethnic groups that are most impacted by homelessness requires not just more interventions, but different kinds of interventions and improved program design and delivery. So we'll be talking about that today in this presentation. Next slide, please. Before we get to the inventory recommendations, though, I wanted to quickly recap some of the information that we presented in February that forms the basis of the system modeling. So one of the things that we really need to understand is how many households are experiencing homelessness. And the data you see here was presented in February. It is based on the 2019 point-in-time count, and Jesse Shimon did a lot of work to take that information and calculate an annual total for these three different household types. So as you can see, that adult-only households are the dominant group in your system. There are about 12/13 of the households experiencing homelessness in a year. And this presentation, because we have very limited time, is really going to focus on the recommendations for that household type. We have done the similar, what you see, we've also done for families with minor children, and the final report that Jesse's working on will have the complete set of recommendations. So there's 12,005 households who have just adults in them. Most of them are people on their own. A few of them have 2 adults in the household, or even a few have more than 2 adults. The main thing about these households is that there are no children. If you could go to the next slide. So keeping that in mind, we want to talk briefly about the housing market. As you've heard in the equity presentation, the housing market is not the only contributing factor to homelessness, but it certainly has in the last few years really been an important part of why homelessness has risen. And I would like to focus here on the fair market rent for a 1-bedroom unit. And often what I understand is that these rents are low, that it's hard to find a unit for $1,800 a month, a 1-bedroom unit. And landlords in the private market are usually looking for people to have, to not be too rent burdened so that they're able to pay that rent every month. So you can see how much income people would need to be able to afford that unit, either at paying 30% of their income, which is usually considered affordable, or at 50%, which is considered rent burden. So that household, 1 or 2 people, would need to have $3,600 a month. Next slide, please. But lower income people in Alameda County are not making that much. If somebody has a full-time minimum wage job, they're making somewhere between $2,300 and $2,800 a month. But homeless households, down at the bottom of this slide, 68% of them are making less than $1,000 a month. So clearly there's a humongous gap between the income needed to rent a unit in the private market and the income that people have to pay rent. If you could go to the next slide. Unfortunately, the homeless data for income is not disaggregated by race at this point. It's one of the recommendations that Susan just mentioned, to have more data disaggregated by race. So in the future, when we look at income, we'll also be able to look at it by race. But this information from the Alameda County Public Health Department gives you a sense, both the percent of households in poverty and unemployment over the last 10 years, that African-American households in particular are severely disadvantaged economically, which leads to housing instability and homelessness. So in the future, your presentation will have much clearer data about this, but I think we can see the connection between the income problems we saw on the previous slide for households are also experiencing the same income gap or worse. Next slide, please. So in February, we spent a little time talking about how your current system is serving people. There's neither enough housing interventions nor the right mix of programs to efficiently get people from homelessness into permanent housing. The current system prioritizes the limited resources available to the most vulnerable, including resources like rapid rehousing, which is a temporary program, usually targeted to people with lower needs, is being used to serve higher needs people because there's so few housing resources, and this may be contributing to the high rate of returns to homelessness. In addition, because there's not enough housing interventions, people get stuck in crisis response interventions like shelter. So those interventions aren't used efficiently because there's not flow through the shelter or the crisis interventions into housing. And many people remain homeless year after year, which partially contributes to the rising point in time count numbers. There's a need for both more permanent supportive housing, which is usually targeted to people with long lengths of time homeless and high service needs. But there's also a big gap in the system for households whose experience of homelessness is primarily driven by economic factors, low incomes and high costs of housing. We know from our equity analysis that these structural issues disproportionately impact people of color. So this is your current system, and that black set of arrows is really what has happened in the last few years in those point in time count numbers that Darlene highlighted on the first slide. Next slide, please. So now we come to the system modeling recommendations. And the first thing is that the work groups developed 3 new project types that they felt were missing in the overall set of interventions for people experiencing homelessness. I'm not going to go through the existing project types. Most of you are familiar with the current system, but the new project types, the first one, shallow subsidy, provides a limited rent subsidy support on a permanent basis. So this, for a household that has some income but not enough to pay the rent and no service needs, this is just permanent rental assistance that helps them afford their units. It was also a recommendation to create dedicated affordable housing. So this is similar to affordable housing that's currently available in the community from the Housing Authority and other sources, but it would be access through the homeless system, through the coordinated entry process, and it would be targeted to people with very low incomes, maybe people who just have SSI. It is not meant to be targeted to people with disabilities. It would not have services required or even necessarily associated with it. It's just a different form of affordable housing to fill in the gaps. And one other group that is significant, we did not talk about the age of people who are homeless, but there is a significant number of people over the age of 55 who are experiencing homelessness. And we know from the research that being homeless is extremely physically difficult, and that it causes people to age faster than their biological age. And so there are many seniors who need support with daily living skills, who need a level of care that's not available in permanent supportive housing typically. And so a different project type that is permanent supportive housing specifically for seniors was also developed. With this full set of housing types, the work groups recommend that this would be the way to meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness and help them to exit permanently from homelessness. Next slide, please. I apologize that this is so small on this slide. We will be sending the slides out so you can look at it more clearly. But on the left, the square box is people experiencing homelessness. In this case, the 1,205 households who are homeless annually, the single adult households. Some of them are in shelter, many of them are on the street and served by street outreach or crisis interventions. This model is compared to the prior slide with that big black circle of arrows in the middle. And this is the different pathways that are identified by the system modeling work groups as better meeting people's needs. And I'm going to quickly go through them. I'm sorry that it's small, but the top group is there's an expectation that about 10% of people can resolve their homelessness with just brief assistance from a shelter or crisis intervention. They may not even need any money. They had a crisis and then they're able to move into housing and no longer need the assistance of the system. There's another group that need some support, case management, and very short-term funds, flex funds. This is called housing problem solving in your system. And so they might be in shelter, they might be unsheltered in contact with street outreach, and then a small amount of money may help them get to their own housing. Other people need rapid rehousing, either for a temporary amount of time, 12 to 18 months, and then they would be able to sustain their housing and not need the continuing assistance from the system. You see some gray diagonal lines that are coming into some of the other interventions at the lower part of the screen. That is planned ability to move people out of rapid rehousing into other interventions if rapid rehousing turns out not to be sufficient. So right now, there's not enough capacity in the system and not really effective processes to help people get to the intervention that would better meet their needs once they've been housed, and you know, their time in housing demonstrates that they really need additional level of support. And so what this process did was plan in the ability and the capacity to move people to the appropriate intervention. So then we come to the 4 circles on the lower part of the screen, and these are the permanent housing programs. The first is shallow subsidy. People may go directly from the shelter into a shallow subsidy. They may have some source of income that allows them to pay the rent, and then they need some assistance long term. The next is permanent supportive housing, then dedicated affordable housing, and the PSH senior units. I'm going to draw your attention to the color coding at the bottom of this screen. We looked at the inventory that's currently available in your system. The interventions in green, in this case, there's shelter and transitional housing for youth, which is the circle that's just to the right of the box. There is adequate inventory. There's not enough, but if the system was operating efficiently, there would be adequate inventory to meet people's needs. There is limited inventory, but it is available for housing problem solving, flex funds, rapid rehousing, and PSH. Not enough to meet everybody's needs, which is partly why the crisis is at where it's at, but these models do exist. The 3 models in red, shallow subsidy, dedicated affordable housing, and permanent supportive housing for seniors, have extremely limited inventory, primarily controlled through the Healthcare Services Agency. And these are the missing interventions. When you think about that picture of what people need that the equity presentation presented, these interventions are where the system just can't provide the support to help people permanently in their homelessness. So if they are assisted housing, we didn't talk about returns to homelessness, but there is a gap in returns to homelessness with African Americans turning at a higher rate. And that is partly because these missing interventions just aren't there to support them in the way that they're needed. So I wanted to say before we move on that I've done system modeling. This is the 3rd community where I've spent extensive time working with communities who do this planning. And the other models that I've helped develop don't look like this. The equity analysis fundamentally changed the recommendations with the development of the new program models and pathways. And this is a vision of a more equitable system than with interventions that will reduce disparities. And as Mayor Schaaf said, it is a model nationally for HUD and for communities. And with the coronavirus relief funds and the CARES Act funds, HUD's priority is that they're implemented with equity, and you really are leading the way in doing that. So next slide, please. So the investment scenarios involve a lot of assumptions about increases in annual inflow and returns to homelessness. And we were asked to try to think about how much money would it take to have the optimal system be implemented in your community. And we went through a long process to develop program cost estimates for each of these program types that we just discussed. And look at different scenarios of annual inflow. Right now, the point in time count numbers that Darlene shared with you at the beginning, that's about a 40% increase between 2015 and 2017 and 2019, or 2017 and 2019. So the homelessness is increasing somewhere at a rate of about 20% a year before we had the COVID crisis. So trying to understand what the inflow will be in the future, then thinking about the impact on returns to homelessness, which are very high right now, and how if you had better interventions, returns would go down. All of those assumptions were taken into account in the impact analysis that we're going to show you in a minute. But what the main recommendation we have is that you start investing in the missing interventions to create the flow through the crisis interventions that you do have, so those resources can serve more people, and that you create new permanent housing interventions that will allow better targeting of rapid rehousing so that program could be more successful. So once the system changes in the way that we're describing, you won't need the level of intense services for all of the people who are currently homeless, who've been homeless long term, and who have fairly intense needs. And there will be a moment when it's time to redo the modeling and think about just more focused on people who became homeless this month or last month, and what kind of services and interventions do they need. And that may change your system a lot. So really what we've modeled for is your current system because of the situation you're in. And as that situation can be changed, then you'll be a better chance of being able to have a less intensive interventions going forward. Next slide, please. I'm gonna have to apologize again because this is too small, but to try to make this accessible, to think about it not on the scale of 12,000, we thought, let's think about the combination of project types that would be needed by 100 single households in a year. So there's a set of crisis response options that are needed to help people stay safe, to support them while they're homeless and looking for housing. And then there's the housing interventions that are needed by those 100 households. And this proportions that you see here are based on the pathways we saw in the previous graphic. So for 100 households, there would need to be 3 permanent housing problem solving flex fund slots. I'm sorry, somebody is weed whacking. And those flex fund slots would turn over at about 4 times a year. So they're serving more than one household at a time because we're expecting there's flow and the people are targeted with the right level of intervention. The emergency shelter beds also would turn over approximately 4 times a year. So it's 12 beds, but that's 48 people out of 100 that would be served in shelter. And then we also have transitional housing for youth serving 18 to 24-year-olds. Those 2 beds would be expected to be filled for a longer term, 6 months or so on average. So we also know that there's substantial street outreach and infrastructure for people who are unsheltered. What the modeling chose not to fund or to recommend shelter for everybody because the focus is on housing. The goal is ending unsheltered homelessness, not shifting everybody to shelter. So the hope is that as housing interventions are brought online, that we have less unsheltered homelessness, that people move from unsheltered homelessness into housing. On the other side, and I'm worried about time, and I'm not reading the chat, so I don't know how I'm doing. There you can see the number of interventions that are recommended of each housing type, and I'm not going to go through it. At the bottom, we have full cost for a year. Based on our program cost estimates, it's $2.3 million to provide these interventions for 100 households in a year. But there is a lot of permanent housing on the right side of this slide. And once somebody is in a permanent unit, that you need to budget to keep them in that unit. So if we think about this as a 5-year plan, which is what we're doing here, in the first year, it's $2.3 million. In the following 4 years, to keep the people housed, interventions, it's another $6 million over the next 4 years to meet the needs of those 100 households. Okay, next slide, please. So if we can take that idea and blow it up to thinking about those 1,200 households, then we can think about how do we bend the curve? How do we get away from having this increase of somewhere around 20% a year on the point in time count, and think about investment that will really make a difference and get people who have been homeless year after year off the street into housing and be able to move with that green line down. So the current level of investment, where you have about 243 new housing resources a year, is where you're at. You can see that in those point in time count numbers. The orange level of investment is thinking about spending money only on one project type. And unfortunately, money is not all the same. Some money is one-time money, and it's easier to spend on certain project types where we've already talked about how they may not meet people's needs. So it's possible to increase funding and not have the impact that you want. To be able to really bend this curve, it is significant investment in the set of recommendations that we've talked about to make homelessness rare, be brief, and non-recurring. And what you're looking at is over 5 years, the point in time count number over 5 years. And we have a scenario on the next slide. So we looked at what would it take to end people remaining in homelessness year after year in 4 years. And then what would that mean for your system? And this again, I'm sorry, it's too small, but the blue line is the annual number of households who are homeless in the system in a year. And you can see you're starting right about 12,000, and that number goes up because the increase in this model is that it will go up 8% a year. And that is, generous considering where the point in time count has been in previous years. But as investment goes up, as you can see, the amount of money spent each year goes up. The remainers, that green line, starts to go down. And gradually, as the exits increase, the red line, the blue line starts to go down. So in year 4, if you look at the money, it costs $270 million to house that last remainer in your system. But in year 5, you don't need to keep spending that money on the remainers. The investment drops to $170 million because you've really turned the corner at that point. So this is $820 million. It is an overwhelming amount of money, but the problem is fairly overwhelming. So the question is how to do this. And other people will be talking about that in a moment. But we have the ability to model different assumptions and look at this in different ways. We'll get to a geographic breakout in a moment, looking across the different regions in the county. But we wanted to share this scenario to you to help you see what is the scale that is needed to be able to end to really make an impact on chronic homelessness overall. All right, next slide. I'm almost done. We did want to recognize that there are other system level investments that need to be made. These include engagement resources like outreach and multi-service centers that are not part of the pathways in the model. The call center that is part of the coordinated entry process, coordinated entry itself, and HMIS. So that $820 million doesn't fully account for the costs of the homeless system. And then my last slide. So we have in the very complex modeling spreadsheet that Stephanie has helped build, we have put in the point in time count breakdown by region from 2019. And we've been able to project the inventory needs by geography for the different types of interventions. This is not the exact same scenario that we just looked at with the line graph with the $820 million. This scenario is thinking about all adults-only households in a year, approximately that 12,000 households. What amount of inventory of each type of intervention do you need? In the entire COC, that's the top line, the full county, and then each part of the county. There's not enough time to go into this really, but we are available to do individual calls to really dive into these numbers and help you think about what if scenarios, if that would be useful to you in your planning. And that's my presentation. I hope I didn't take up too much time.
Thanks so much, Joyce. We are just a tiny bit behind, so I think that we should stop and do some Q&A. There has been a very active chat thread going on.
Wow.
So
yeah,
that's great. But so participants, you can, I think you can raise your hand at the bottom of the participants, and Julie will unmute to ask questions. We'll spend about 5 minutes.
Hi, everybody. So we can start out with Lauren's question in the chat, Lauren Taylor, who asks, what about the investment into workforce development, leveling up skills to allow for those who can increase their capacity to cover a greater percentage of their own housing costs? How do those investments play a role in reducing the need levied on the entire system?
That's absolutely correct. And we did not consider that additional investment. But I think that would be a great addition to this modeling, and then would allow the thought about moving on people from shallow subsidy or dedicated affordable housing that would ultimately reduce the cost in the homeless system if people could assume a greater portion of their rent.
That's great. I don't see any raised hands here. Am I missing folks? If the hand raising's not work, feel free to ask a question in the chat.
And I'll try to answer chat questions now that I'm not talking.
Jesse or Dorcas, am I missing something? Where would I see raising hands? I have.
I'm taking a quick look. I don't see any raised hands. Again, if you want to raise your hand, you click the participant list, and then if you, oh, I'm sorry.
Great. I see one here from Cynthia Najendra. Hi, Cynthia. Congratulations on this amazing work and for this fantastic presentation. Joyce mentioned that the equity analysis lens changed system modeling recommendations. How so?
Well, the project types, the shallow subsidy, the dedicated affordable housing, and the permanent supportive housing for seniors all grew out of part of wanting to think about how to more effectively serve people, particularly people disproportionately impacted by homelessness. And the program models, which we didn't even get a chance to touch on, but there are multi-page descriptions of each of these program models with core elements of them, were also reviewed extensively by the equity work group with additions and adjustments to the program models so that the system would have practices that would better meet people's needs. You know, we heard in the earlier presentation about all the barriers to housing, and you know, the responsibility of the programs to overcome some of those barriers to make sure that people are getting into housing and staying in housing.
Great. So we have a question here from Jackie Downing. Hi, Jackie. Fabulous work. Aside from the money, what will it take to move from plan to implementation? In other words, if the money were not the issue, what else needs to be changed or addressed?
I feel like the next presentation might be better suited to address some of that. I think always questions of political will and siting become obstacles even when there is money and capacity in providers. $820 million more dollars into the system would be a huge challenge to providers to be able to ramp up. And we see that in LA with the bond measure that passed a few years ago, that it's been a major challenge to get all that money out on the street. So a lot of planning would be needed in addition to the just by securing all of that money.
Okay, thanks. We'll continue the discussion in the chat. But now I'm going to move us ahead to talk about initial investment and alignment of investment in to the models and other commitments. So I'm pleased to introduce Colleen Chawla, who's going to talk about the Home Together investment plan.
Thank you very much, Jesse. So we had talked about the Home Together ballot initiative back in our first meeting together, and we're here to give you an update on where that is. If you could go to the next slide, please. So since we have talked last, or since we initiated the conversation, we've held 9 policy committee meetings in order to create the framework for the measure. We've had countywide provider meetings. There are a series of meetings with homeless service providers which turned into a mix of in-person and virtual meetings as the shelter-in-place order took effect. We were able to meet with more than 100 providers to gather input into the Home Together investment plan. We held 3 virtual town halls with Alameda County district supervisors. The town halls in total were attended by over 300 residents from throughout the county, including elected officials and service providers and others affected by homelessness in Alameda County. We had individual meetings with 14 mayors, city managers, or other elected officials, and had conducted additional stakeholder outreach with other identified partners to all of the elected officials that we talked to. Response to the investment plan was overwhelmingly supportive, with many acknowledging the needs and disparities that COVID-19 has highlighted for those experiencing homelessness. So right now we are incorporating all of that feedback, and the policy committee is reconvening to integrate the input into the framework. If you could go to the next slide, please. So now a little bit about what that framework is. Next slide, please. The guiding principles that we've held throughout this process are to prioritize housing interventions that end homelessness. So the goal here is to emphasize housing programs over temporary solutions. We want to include people who have been homeless and navigated our systems to inform how we can improve them. We want to use the strongest models in all areas, but remain responsive to local needs in each region of the county. We want to use results-based accountability and annually revisit systems modeling as the underpinning of our investment plan. And many strong programs and resources are in Alameda County, and we need to join them together to better expand on the strengths of our system. Next slide, please. So the ballot measure is now, we're looking at a 1/2-cent general sales tax on the November 2020 ballot that would fund additional and ongoing needs. So it would require a 50% +1 to pass. You may recall that conversations previously had been looking at a special tax, and based on the current situation and the changes to our economy, a decision was made to move forward with the 1/2-cent general sales tax. The original projections were for 150 to 160 million. That gets to the question that was asked earlier: how do we infuse a system with over $800 million of resources? This gets us some of the way, but certainly not all of the way to what we would need to make that happen. But now we expect it will be less, but have not received new estimates. The sales tax revenues, because of the shelter in place, is likely to be less than our original estimates. So the Policy and Accountability Committee will be established to make annual and multi-year recommendations to the county. And so there's more information on that in the next slide. Our revenue allocation, we would be looking at 5 county regions, so allocating funding revenue from the measure by region: North, Oakland, Mid, South, and East. And we would be allocating funding using a weighted average-based point-in-time count plus the % of the sales tax generated. And there would be a collaborative process to review and fund the proposals that would come in for each of those regions. The proposals would be reviewed by the county, by cities, by the COC, and we would use systems modeling as our guide to evaluate them. The regions would be able to spend their funds differently based on systems modeling and local regional needs. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the Planning and Accountability Committee, and this is a summary of the roles and membership of the committee. The membership would include a diversity of lived experience as well as organizational representation. So the supervisorial districts would be represented, cities, county departments, nonprofit providers, healthcare partners, the Continuum of Care, and affordable housing developers or local businesses. And they would be responsible for making recommendations to the county for annual and multi-year spending priorities. They would coordinate with the Continuum of Care, county and cities in planning efforts, evaluate the status of the impact of the tax, and conduct an annual compliance audit by a third-party independent auditor. And last slide, please. We began this work in February. It was seems like such a long time ago now in February, but here we are in June, and to keep us on time for a November ballot measure, we would have the first reading at the Board of Supervisors in June with the second reading at the Board of Supervisors in July, still anticipated to meet this timeline. I'll say too that I understand that additional polling was done, and the polling continues to be supportive of a measure that would support homelessness services in our county, and I think that is a testament to the care that our residents feel for the people who are unsheltered among us, and I think that is a testament to the community that we live in. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to hear from Doug Biggs, the chair of the Continuum of Care Board, about the Continuum of Care's commitment to aligning funding to the models.
Thank you, Jesse. First off, I want to say what an honor it's been serving on this really groundbreaking system modeling effort, particularly around the equity work group that's brought just, a chance to really address some of the root causes of homelessness. And it's been an honor to serve as co-chair with Mayor Schaaf and Director Chawla. I also want to appreciate all of the city staff from numerous cities and the electeds that have been involved throughout this system modeling process. It's really shown a commitment on your part. I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out, particularly to my own mayor, Marilyn Izzy Ashcraft, who's here today and has been at a lot of the meetings. And under Mayor Ashcraft's leadership, Alameda, like many small communities in Alameda County throughout this, have really leaned into the crisis and found new ways to help serve the most critically needed services for our unhoused neighbors. And in Alameda, we've set up a trailer program. We're starting overnight parking, and we're starting a drop-in day center. Those are programs that if you'd mentioned them in Alameda even 3 years ago, wouldn't have gotten any traction at all. But under her leadership, we've really been able to move the needle forward on that. The Continuum of Care commitment. So do we have another slide on this, Jesse, with the numbers? Oh, good, we do. Okay. So the Continuum of Care is responsible for managing the HUD allotment to Alameda County, which is substantial and has grown year over year, doing, in large part to the excellent programs that our service providers provide. We wanted to talk about this a little bit today just to show that we're not starting from zero in this new system modeling effort, that there's a lot of current funding, both the direct funding that the COC manages as well as leveraged funds that the COC also is responsible for administering, and we'll be talking about those in a minute. And we're already addressing some of the endpoints in the system modeling design that was shown earlier. So we've already got funding that's going towards rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and transitional housing. And it's the task and the commitment of the Continuum of Care to use system modeling as a guide in setting the priorities for allocation of the HUD funding going forward, so that we can, if there's areas that need to be right-sized, we can right-size them. If there's areas where leveraging some of these funding will bring in much larger amounts of funding, we'll look at doing that. But the commitment is not just to raise new funding, which is absolutely essential to make this successful, but also to ensure that the existing funding that is allocated is being used to the highest and best use that it can be. And that's my very brief presentation on this.
Thanks so much, Doug. Now we're going to hear from Julie Ledbetter, the Director of System Coordination, about the HAP use of funds, the county and the COC funds.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to take a break here from monitoring the chat. So hold your questions until I get back after this. But yeah, as all the presenters before have begun to set up, and the reason we're really here today is that we all know it takes advocacy and forward thinking to move from a crisis experience of this situation to a system that we're, as Doug says, really maximizing, using our resources and thinking proactively. So we want to talk a little bit about the process and collaboration between the county and the COC this year, and how we used system modeling to come up with our allocations. Next slide, please. Excellent. So the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Program, as most people know, is state funds, and the county received 8.7 million and the COC received 9.45 million approximately. One-time funds to be spent over 5 years to provide resources to support persons who experience homelessness in Alameda County. Together, we use the system modeling to both evaluate the RFI responses that we got together. And so for those who may not know, the COC chose Alameda County to be our administrative entity for these funds. So we had a unique opportunity to really plan together around the use of funds. We did also plan a bit with the city of Oakland, and as always, try to engage collectively all the stakeholders who would be applying for or benefiting from these funds, from jurisdictions to providers. So we also recognize the limitations of one-time funds and how they could be applied within the system model. So they're more appropriate for certain uses, less appropriate for ongoing housing, which is really what we know we need: ongoing supportive housing and other non-supportive housing. But within that sort of context and framework, the COC and the county work together to really find a way to both support existing needs of the shelter services and navigation centers, to increase sort of outreach and coordination that includes housing navigation, and really for the first time aggressively look at what can we do to, if you think back to that chart of the sorry, it's the system modeling chart where you see the green, the orange, and the red. Because of the one-time funds, we really tried to focus here on supporting parts of the green and moving our system into the orange and into the red. And I think one of the things that is allowable here that the system modeling conversations really pushed is within some of these categories, providers can look at layering shallow subsidies on. So it does present an opportunity to think about shallow subsidies in this. But the overall allocations were rental assistance and rapid rehousing to more than 300 households, and that's at $2 million. Operating subsidies in new and existing affordable or supportive housing units, emergency shelters, and navigation centers, and that was $3,500,000. Outreach coordination, like I said, includes housing navigation, access to jobs, and housing stability, and that was $6 million. A lot there, protecting our current system that's in place. And then a really strong commitment here to moving into that orange category and making a commitment to diversion practice and homeless prevention. And that, we knew we had an inflow problem when we had these conversations. The analysis was showing more people coming in than were exiting. And then that's only getting worse under COVID. So the importance of really standing up a strong diversion practice that is also then linked to new interventions like the shallow subsidy is what is really how we wanted to use new dollars and new thinking here and embrace the ideas of the system modeling. There's also the navigation centers and emergency shelters at 1.2 million. And then the strategic homelessness planning and infrastructure. We didn't get too much into sub-pops, but we know we would like to do further thinking about system modeling for populations like youth. So we put some planning dollars in for that. And We went a little above and beyond the requirement for HAP funds to use 9% of the funds to meet the needs of homeless youth and 7% for administrative costs. But really, it was a great process working together with the county. Because of our proximity to the system modeling, we had a little bit of an early preview into it. And I think it sort of strengthened, particularly with the racial equity, we were watching that unfold and really integrating the new intervention suggestions and integrating it in a way that allowed for our approach to rapid rehousing, but to change it with, you know, the add-on of different forms of rental assistance or support shallow subsidies. So it was the system modeling, I think, really is the way forward here. And it was a collaborative and good process, I think, with the county in doing that. So I think it's a good example of how jurisdictions and other funders can sort of touch base with the system modeling framework and use it to allocate their funds.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah.
So we have a little bit of time. We can do some question and answer. I don't know if we've figured out the raised hands, but the chat is also a good place to ask questions.
So Trish Munro from two people raised their hands. I don't know. Can you see them, Julie, and unmute them? I will go ahead and unmute Trish Munro.
Trish is now unmuted.
Okay.
Thanks, Darkus.
Hi, yeah, I wanted to go back to the sales tax, and I'm trying to understand. So first of all, I very much like the plan, the way that the plan is structured. The funding, I'm not particularly a fan of. I don't see sales tax as regressive. We're concerned about people who have income loss. Before COVID and now particularly after COVID, we know sales taxes have gone down because of COVID. I don't see how this can be a realistic ask for fall, this fall in particular. And then I'm also wondering, given that we're talking about the structural issues, why are we not also looking at finding better funding models that do not rely on, you know, regressive taxes?
Colleen, I'm going to find you again, so maybe you can respond to this.
Certainly I can. I don't disagree with you, and I wish there were other funding sources that would yield us at anywhere close to this level of funding to support our homelessness programs and services. But the reality is that this is the source that allows us to do that. I don't relish having to go to the voters and ask for it, but our polling shows that people are supportive, and I think that they understand that this pandemic is having as much of an impact on, more of an impact on people who are homeless and high risk than ever before. So I wish I had a better answer, but it is our best bet at securing additional resources to serve this population.
Thanks, Colleen. We have a follow-up here asking about the initial projection was 150 to 160 million annually that could be realized from the ballot measure. And has this figure been reassessed since COVID or shelter in place?
It hasn't been officially reassessed, but I can say that our experience with Measure A is analogous, and so we know that Measure A is under 150 now. I think it's in the 140-ish range. So that's the current. That's current. So we haven't done new projections yet.
Okay, I'm gonna unmute Jacqueline McCormick.
Hi, everyone. Thanks loads for this. I mean, it's really great work, and it really addresses all of those segments of homelessness that we've been harping on for years. So thank you. But my question is, how does this amount of funding that's being proposed by this ballot measure, how does it stand up to that slide that talked about the over a 5-year period of getting folks housed? How does it compare to that slide at the beginning of the presentation?
Can we go back to that slide and look at it? I know that was in.
That the total was, I know, 800 and something million. And what's the delta still? That's what I'm concerned about. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Makes it look doable, doesn't it?
Yeah,
at
well,
least, at least in the early years.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you consider, because that's in addition to what we're already getting, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's new revenues, yes.
Right. So we also have the existing. Okay. This is very hopeful. Thank you.
I'm gonna find Joyce here in case, Joyce, you want to add anything on that. Okay, you're unmuted, Joyce.
Yes. Hi. So I responded in the chat, the investments on this slide are in addition to the current system resources, although certainly a review of current investments could be in order to see if they're being used most effectively. I don't think that there's any one funding source that's going to be able to make up all of what's needed to be able to create the optimal system. But having this sales tax measure at the start of launching a plan like this really gives you a great leg up to start implementing this as you build support for additional resources from the state, maybe from the feds. And, you know, COVID is a tragedy, and there are going to be new resources, which you'll hear about in the next section. So it will take a blend of resources to get to this 820 million.
Thank you. I'm looking for any other raised hands. We have a system modeling question from Emma, and I think, Emma, I'll leave that question for Joyce to answer in the chat so we can move forward with the agenda.
Okay, so we're waiting for the slides to catch up. Great, so now we are going to hear about some COVID response opportunities from Carrie Abbott, the Director of the Office of Homeless Care and Coordination, Peter Radu from the City of Oakland, and Jamie Almanza from Bay Area Community Services.
Carrie, you're unmuted on your phone.
Thank you so much, Julie. And in case I don't get another chance before the end of the meeting, thank you so much for your several years now of service at Everyone Home. I'd like to thank you in front of all these prominent, important people for your commitment and compassion.
Oh, thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit about how we've been responding as a community to COVID-19 for people experiencing homelessness. And then I'm going to share this section with Jamie Almanza from BACS and Peter Radu from City of Oakland. Can I go to the next slide, please? So some of our main strategies at Healthcare Services Agency have been to lease sites, and mostly under the state-initiated Project Room Key program. We have 4 current sites leased and additional ones in negotiation. We also have been looking at a housing strategy for people, whether they're in the non-congregate shelter or not, to try to move into housing where they can live safely after COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. And within that housing strategy, we've been looking at flexible subsidy options, supportive housing, and acquisition strategies. And the acquisition strategy, we have been looking at options to purchase buildings and looking for opportunities where prices may drop or where industries may change, where we may be able to secure many units of housing and really trying to position ourselves as a system of care to take advantage of whatever economic changes could give us an opportunity to really get more affordability within our system for people who are homeless. So the next slide. So this is what we have kind of in operations at this moment. We leased, the state actually came in and leased the Comfort Inn and the Radisson, and we're working with Abode Services and the state of California on referrals to those sites and services within those sites. It's been an amazing collaboration. Abode kind of jumped into this on about 24 hours notice and started running almost 400 units. The county with Abode and Oakland and the state managed to move in almost 400 people over the course of the first month. And if for perspective, if you look back at the permanent supportive housing move-ins, you don't have to do it right this second, but we were moving in about 250 people a year to permanent supportive housing. So just the scale of this operation was really exciting, inspiring, and hard. We also more recently have entered into leases at the beginning of May for the Quality Inn and the Marina Village Inn. So that's a total of 522 rooms under lease right now. Our current occupancy, this is as of yesterday, was 412. And that's with 2 new buildings just having started renting up. So that has been really exciting, and we've been looking in all of these sites at the possibility for sustainability, either within these buildings or with other opportunities. So the next slide. The ones under consideration likely, these 2 go to the Board of Supervisors on June 2nd. The Spring Hill site in Newark would give us 119 rooms in South County, where we haven't been able to put Project Room Key COVID housing yet. And then the Lake Merritt Lodge or Holt Lodge in Oakland is a building that we are hoping to acquire. We're also looking at other buildings for acquisition and lease, kind of trying to use all of our COVID resources, all of the emergency resources, as many as possible to assist people who would otherwise be outside, who are experiencing homelessness and very much vulnerable to COVID and at risk for acquiring COVID. The next slide. So this is a picture of the Holt Lodge. It's really a beautiful site, and we worked closely with the City of Oakland in looking at this site and trying to figure out how we could all work together to bring it into our portfolio. Next slide. So it was built in 1925, renovated in 2015. It was originally offered at it was actually over 31 million. And what I first heard was 31 million. And the current agreement we are hoping to acquire for 23.3. Next slide. About the site. So it's currently completely vacant, which is a great opportunity for us to be able to move people in. It has 92 rooms, singles and doubles, has laundry, elevator, large common areas, and in a really convenient location. Next slide. The financing, the purchase costs that would be paid using state and federal funding sources that are specifically available for COVID-19. We can use the Emergency Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Funds that are eligible for acquisition. The COVID-19 emergency HAP funds have to be encumbered by June 30th. So this gives us an opportunity to use the money sort of effectively and quickly. And then ongoing operational costs would be also through state and federal funding sources available for COVID. So during the term of the emergency, we have the opportunity to bring people into these lovely rooms and allow them to shelter in place. Next slide. So the operations plan, this is just kind of what's going into the COVID housing, what we're putting in place to operate these sites. The hotel in the leased site is offering staff and security. So for this site, we would also need to staff those up. The wraparound services, we had been budgeting at about 1 to 25. So one service navigator, if you will, for each 25 guests. And then the Healthcare Services Agency and AHS and other medical FQHC providers are doing medical screening, coordinated referral system, nursing support, wellness checks, behavioral health, substance use treatment, and pharmacy services all at the site. We also have leverage support with our partners at the Social Services Agency doing benefits navigation and connecting people to vocational support. Next slide. This is what the timeline looks like. We first looked at the financing and operating strategy quite recently. The June 2nd board review is of the full proposal with purchase agreement. And then due diligence would start immediately. We're talking about a 15-day escrow period, also pretty unprecedented. The sale could be final as soon as June 18th, and operations could begin as soon as July 1st. And those of you who have been in Alameda County for a long time are certainly familiar with that being a pretty unusual timeline. And I think that's it about the Holt Lodge, of the long-term use. So thank you. So the long-term use actually contributes probably more to the systems modeling portion of the conversation than the COVID use, although the COVID use is very critical as an emergency shelter use. It would be an owned asset, and the 92 rooms would be available ongoing. And we're currently looking at feasibility for the right target population for the site, given the resources in the county and the level of need among our homeless population. So again, system modeling should come into play to help inform the decision. Okay.
Jamie, I think I unmuted your phone. Does that work?
It does. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Jamie Almanza from BACS. I just also, too, wanted to say thank you to everyone. I sit here privileged to live in a community that actually was brave enough to step back and do a racial equity analysis during COVID and during system modeling. And so I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that was involved. I was tasked today to really talk about the momentum and really what I think is an inflection point for our community as it relates to everything you've heard thus far and how to represent what happens on the ground doing the day-to-day work for these very communities that we're all here to serve. Next slide. I wanted to start by really talking about the homeless prevention and really targeted prevention work that I think Doug said it best earlier. We are not starting from ground zero in our community. We already have lots of infrastructure and lots of programming and services that are happening that really complement the systems modeling work. I wanted to highlight a little bit about our Keep Oakland House program, which has been in existence for almost 2 years now and has been privately funded and by philanthropy and by Kaiser Permanente and supported by the city of Oakland thus far, and the learnings that we've had in our community and how this really relates to the system modeling work that we are embarking on together. When Keep Oakland House started, it started as a real anti-displacement, anti-poverty program in that it was really targeting those leaseholders that were impoverished in Oakland and who had a housing crisis. We've served 2,000 households at this point, and it is very economical in terms of the amount of financial resources that have gone to keep those households in those homes. And what we did most recently through the system modeling work and through really the leadership of the Keep Oakland House table is we realized that we needed to go more downstream to the front door of homelessness. And that is supported by the systems modeling work and the national data that really validates
what is needed to protect people from literally falling into homelessness. And so what Keep Oakland House did most recently is we adjusted the target population in line with the modeling work we're all talking about, where we removed the requirement of a family or an individual needing to hold a lease. And we kept it, of course, targeting our poor communities and vulnerable populations who were experiencing a housing crisis, and really are looking to target people who otherwise will fall into street homelessness so that we can really stop the inflow of our point-in-time numbers year over year. Next slide. So a little bit about that pivot, just it's been only a few months, but in our targeted downstream approach, we've already served 115 people since April 1 that are the more downstream population. About 90% of those individuals and families did need some minimum flex funds that averaged about $1,850 per household. We are, of course, still serving the target population of the Black African American identified community, and that 85% of the people we've served in this downstream approach identify as such. And interestingly enough, and I think this is going to be really in line with our modeling work, about 10% of those individuals and families could not stay in the unit that they were living in. And so we actually had to go through the process of rehousing them, which we're going to keep a close eye on because that work does dovetail with our system modeling approach. The interventions of downstream prevention are pretty pragmatic and simple. It does require deep case management, really looking at the different life domains. It absolutely requires flexible funds, and really we're also piloting the shallow subsidy approach that we're all talking about. And then also I think what's most important is it's not one time, and families and individuals, if this intervention does not work, they're encouraged to come back and get more support. So we are following the individual and family member to make sure that it's not just a one and done, and that the services and financial flexible service support is available for people to keep them inside. Next slide. So as this relates to system modeling, the housing problem solving approach is really what we need to embed throughout our entire system. I think the good news is that we have spent as a system and community the last few years building infrastructure through our coordinated entry system and through our housing resource centers. And so what the community really needs to do, and has already gotten a head start through Oakland and other cities, is training all of the practitioners on the ground in this housing problem solving approach, and really looking at who we're targeting. So targeting individuals who are doubled up, who are couch surfers, who aren't holding leases. Margot Cushell, who is an expert in research, she always gives the advice that if you're really looking at targeted prevention and there's only one group you can target, you should be targeting the people who were formerly homeless, because that is the proxy of the individuals and families who are most likely to return to homelessness. So we are, through our approach, doing a prioritization tool format and making sure that we're targeting people who without this intervention most likely would become homeless. Just to share in our last point in time count in Alameda, 5% of our point in time count were newly homeless. And so you extrapolate that to our system modeling, this intervention really is targeting or trying to stop the inflow of the 3 people coming into the system for every 1 person leaving the system. Next slide. I also wanted to share this. This is actually a real couple and a real call that we received yesterday as a referral from a colleague. And it's a couple that many people probably have seen on the news, but there was a couple who moved last year into Piedmont because a generous person opened up his home and moved them from street homelessness into his home. He is since selling his home. And so, of course, this couple needs support in terms of rehousing. And it really encapsulates what housing problem solving is, but I think it also underscores the bloated middle and the gap that we're all struggling with within our system. So the couple, just as a quick profile,
It's two people, one's 60 years old, one's 50 years old. One of the two is on disability. The other person has been denied disability benefits, I think on their third denial. So their combined income is something around $1,500. And both have Medi-Cal, both were long-time homeless in Oakland and Berkeley for 10 years before having this opportunity to move into this home. And now both of them have to leave this home by the end of the summer. So of course they need help. And as a practitioner in this work, you know, this is the steps we're taking now in real time. And I want us to really think about our system modeling and what this means in terms of where the system is evolving to, because as of today, we don't necessarily have the available support to help this couple not return to the streets unless you really start to leverage housing problem solving and shallow subsidies and or flexible subsidies. So we're in the process of assessing them through our coordinated entry system. Of course, because they're not literally homeless, they are not eligible for certain supports right now. And of course, we want to build a system where people don't have to touch homelessness before they can get support. They're not interested in shared housing. And I think that comes up as practitioners all the time, where individuals and families have been, you know, burnt in certain types of housing. And in our system, going back to the slides that Joyce presented, you can only afford a bunk bed in a bedroom right now for $800 or $900, which to most people is not a healthy or high quality housing placement. So then you ask yourself, what's next? And so what we're really looking at is how we can leverage flexible subsidy while the second individual gets their SSI, and really looking at how do you find housing for someone where they won't be extremely rent burdened, but they'll get to stay in their community that they've lived in for years. And I think that's the dilemma before us right now, and I think that's the moral question for us. So as we're looking to fund the system that we have all spent time modeling, what do we as practitioners do now? And that's something that I think is a question for all of us during this time. Next slide, please. So in just interest in time, because I know I need to share with Peter here. So really talking about the permanent supportive housing approach and some of the challenges we've had within the coordinated entry system as we evaluate and systematize our next steps and our next approaches. I think we really have to look at efficiencies in our system. I think someone in the chat had said, you know, there is 60 or 80% of people right now that are not getting service because we have a scarcity mentality. And so how do we become even more efficient than we already are using approaches? How are we going to think about using interim and transitional housing as a system right now, knowing that rapid rehousing has been inappropriately and inadequately utilized in the last couple of years? Next slide. There's been a lot of chat in the chat room already, but we are really diving into employment services, and the Keep Oakland Housed program as a collaborative. One of the other gaps that we realized in making sure that people retain housing stability is how we increase individuals and families' incomes and their upward mobility. And so right now we're in the process of embarking on a gap analysis in our system of employment services and workforce development. And those who said that in the chat are right, spot on the money, no pun intended. And how do you really think about, as we're moving people inside, how we're increasing their economic capacity through employment and workforce development, and enriching each of the families and individuals so that they can maintain their housing, but more importantly, they can start to rebuild wealth in our community. Next slide. Also, I think this is a big part of system modeling. One of the things we frankly have not been able to do very well in our system because of the lack of resources and the lack of housing is how you create flow through a shelter system. And we don't want to do what other communities like New York does, where you move everybody inside and you prioritize emergency shelter, but then you can never exit emergency shelter. And so part of our housing problem solving and our targeting approach is really working and starting to collaborate with long-term stayers and shelters, but also individuals and families that are new to the homeless system and targeting them so they can get in and out of the homeless system and don't become kind of stuck and institutionalized in the system. And so those are things that we will complement through our approach as well. Next slide. And just finishing up here, one of the things I do want to highlight is that our Kaiser Sprint project, and I just want to give a shout out to Kaiser Permanente and Angela, who I believe is on the call. We embarked with the city of Oakland and Kaiser, I guess that was last year, with a rapid task of housing seniors who were literally homeless in Oakland. And this project will be actually researched and evaluated by Margot Kuchel's office. But I wanted to highlight a little bit of hope and how we ended up really pivoting the program, which started as more of a rapid rehousing program. I like to say rapid rehousing on steroids. But really it's turned into also piloting a shallow subsidy program because out of these 515 Oaklanders, 71% of them moved into shared housing. During the time, 6% of them received PSH, which is great. 15% of them will not be able to sustain housing without some type of shallow subsidy. And so the model was really smart in that it kind of encumbered or created a capitalized operating subsidy where we can individualize support for each individual to make sure that they don't return to homelessness. And I think this project will, over time, show that we can get out of our way in terms of thinking very rigidly about different program models. You know, rapid rehousing as a type, maybe it turns into an individualized model where one person may need 3 to 5 years of subsidy because we're going to group workforce and employment services and stability with that individual, as opposed to having a system that is very rigid. So stay tuned for that research and analysis over time, which I hope will complement the system modeling that we're doing. Next slide. And I think that's it. We're going to save questions, but I'll pass it over to Peter.
Okay, Peter, you're unmuted. Thank you, Jamie.
Hi, everybody. I am going to be very brief because we are about 12 minutes until others need to get on to a meeting. But I wanted to wrap up I'm from the city of Oakland. Those of you who don't know me, I work in the mayor's office. And I wanted to spend just a minute talking about how we're going to use this moment to start not just responding to COVID-19, but also to start chipping away at these goals and making one specific proposal that I think decision makers and funders on this call might want to consider. So the past several months have made a variety of new funding sources available to us. The spigot really has been a fire hose. CARES Act has given us big tranches of CDBG, ESG, and HOPWA. A lot of the traditional restrictions that make those dollars more difficult to spend have been waived. In addition, the state budget proposal is looking pretty grim, but one thing that is in there is $600 million in new money in CARES Act money, specifically coronavirus relief money, that the governor has proposed be used to acquire Project Roomkey hotel property sites. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. There are other forthcoming permanent sources, including a new tranche of HUD mainstream vouchers that can be used to serve non-elderly people with disabilities. And I know that various jurisdictions within Alameda County have already been using those very successfully in alignment with our coordinated entry system. There's the SB2 allocation, and who knows what the HEROES Act or some other additional stimulus bill at the congressional level, should any pass, might bring. Can I have the next slide, please? The problem here is that we have a mismatch between what we have and what we need. The systems modeling shows us that, and this is no news to anyone who's been working on homelessness for more than just a minute, but we need permanent housing stock. We need permanent permanent interventions, but really what we have now, especially with these COVID-19 funds, are one-time sources. What I would encourage that we all think about, especially in this COVID moment, as the county's bringing hotels online, and as we're thinking about through our 100-day challenge, how do we exit as many people from our Project Roomkey hotels as possible? The state's money that is being proposed in the governor's budget, $600 million for Project Roomkey hotel acquisitions, as I mentioned, is actually the Coronavirus Relief Fund money. That is the most flexible source of money, and I think the single largest pot of money from the CARES Act. Our office, the mayor has already submitted a letter. Our office is already all over advocating to our partners at the state to allow for the maximum level of flexibility on these dollars for not just capital acquisitions of hotels, but for other flexible sources as well. One of which that I really want to focus us on now is a way to take these one-time dollars and stretch them out to make them more of a permanent intervention. And that is through this idea of a capitalized reserve, not just for operating and subsidy, but potentially even for services. The Coronavirus Relief Fund money really is extremely flexible, as I've mentioned. The guidance from the Treasury Department on this fund is scant. It's a 4-page document. And it essentially, there are three things that a local jurisdiction needs to prove. One, that this was a necessary expenditure that was incurred. So that's A, that was incurred between March 1st and December 31st of this year. B, and C, that it was not previously budgeted for. The Treasury Department literature specifically refers to homelessness as a necessary expenditure. If the state is arguing that purchasing hotels is necessary, then presumably it's because it believes that the act of not just sheltering people experiencing homelessness is necessary, but that it's also necessary to permanently house them. And we know from decades of literature and experience that this is not only a cost-effective intervention, but it's the way to end homelessness. So the recommendation here is that for whatever monies, assuming that we can successfully advocate for flexibility to the state, and assuming that we can get the state and federal partners to buy into the idea, which I don't think is too much of a stretch, that committing money in the form of a capitalized reserve constitutes an expenditure by the expenditure deadline at the end of this calendar year, that we commit to using as much of these funds as possible. Again, the $600 million coming through the state budget, if that should pass the legislature, to commit those to capitalized reserves as much as possible to start chipping away at these systems model recommendations. I just lost my place in my notes. Bear with me for 1 second. This is a way to stretch these dollars and to start actually permanently housing people. And it's a way to also leverage some of these other sources that I've talked about. For example, 3 things come to mind. One is the mainstream, a new tranche of mainstream vouchers. Might those be project-based? One is our permanent local housing allocation, or SB2 dollars. There's already several people I know at the county level who are pushing that those dollars be used for such a purpose to capitalize a reserve. And so, and there's also A1 money and BMR units. You can imagine capitalizing a shallow subsidy, for example, and buying down additional affordability on some of those units for people who are extremely low income. If we act with urgency, especially if these funds are competitive, and if we're successful in winning some of the flexibility that I think the federal guidance allows for, and that I think would be politically tenable if we were to really push for it, I don't think there's any reason why our county shouldn't be first in line with viable projects and a viable rationale. As we've spent the last 2 hours talking about, we have now demonstrated exactly what we need and what it costs. We should be first in line for literally every dollar. We have a large pipeline of projects. Let's get to work in funding them and getting them off the ground. Can I have the last slide? This last slide just gives you an idea of what that looks like. This is some work that I want to thank Joanne from All Home, who's on the call, for helping us out with this. Really taking some of these cost estimates and some of these modeling assumptions to model out what would it look like and what would it cost if we were to take all of the 4,000 people that Alameda County has identified, 4,000 people experiencing homelessness who are vulnerable to COVID-19 per CDC sort of baseline guidance, and start actually exiting them out of homelessness and into housing. This is a breakdown of what that might look like, again, using the systems modeling breakdown of assumptions. $87.5 million is not a lot of money if we're getting a big tranche of money that can be used for capital acquisitions and capital reserves from the state. The state budget picture is pretty grim. It is unlikely that we're going to see an ongoing source of funding anytime soon. If we want to actually start chipping away at permanently housing people, I think this is the moment that we start taking advantage of that. And so I will end there. Looks like we have 3 minutes for questions. I can't help myself. I say I'm going to be brief, and then here I go. So I apologize for that. But I hope you find it compelling. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who presented before me for all your work on this. This has been an incredible journey. And this is these models are already making waves at the state level. So I really appreciate everybody's support and everybody's partnership on this. Thank you so much, and congratulations.
Thank you, Peter. I think we actually don't have time for questions, so I'm gonna leave it to the robust chat room right now and just move very quickly. I have the honor of showcasing the broad support and participation in this project. Thank you to everyone who participated in the working groups and in the focus groups. The racial equity impact analysis and system modeling project, it just wouldn't have happened without your hard work and creativity and dedication. And I also want to thank the team from APT, Joyce, Stephanie, Megan, Chloe, I think is on the call too. They worked really hard, and they always met our sort of questions and needs with a yes, or we'll try. So much appreciated. There were a lot of late nights and weekends, and a lot of hard work went into this. So thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it off to Director Chawla to bring us home.
Hold on 1 second. I'm getting to you.
Great.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody. I'm so proud to join Mayor Schaaf and Doug Biggs to jointly sponsor this important work. This was a huge undertaking as it was originally planned, and then COVID. And that further strained the resources among the participants, but the team persisted because the need is as great as ever. And not only did they persist, but they excelled. And in doing so, we have laid a path for others to follow by adding a groundbreaking race equity overlay to this entire process. I am so honored to be associated with this important work in collaboration, and my sincere gratitude to all of you. All of us as systems leaders should be really proud to own this work. Now the implementation begins, but it is bolstered by the partnerships and collaborations that have strengthened our systems by doing the systems modeling work together. Thank you all so very much.